Today, we are going to talk about literacy in the ancient Near East on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, today's topic is the literacy in the ancient Near East. And the interesting thing about literacy in the ancient Near East is, well, it's tied directly to the advent of writing. When we talk about literacy, we are talking about the ability to read. And the ability to read wasn't an issue until the development of writing itself. Now, the development of writing takes place roughly around 3100 BC. And it's a toss-up of who invented writing first, whether it was, say, the Sumerians or the Egyptians. Either way, both of those societies developed into reading cultures. Now, when we talk about literacy, one of the misconceptions that we have today about literacy is that it is a smooth upward trend where over time people become more and more literate as, the centuries go on. The reality is a little more nuanced than that. First of all, the percentage of the population that can actually read tends to go up and down over time. So literacy is not just straight line up. It tends to rise and fall with the society at large. Furthermore, the other factor of literacy that we need to take into account is the depth of literacy, essentially the reading level. That too can vary dramatically with the times in history. Like, for example, people in the late Victorian, early 20th century actually had a higher reading comprehension. So if you were a college-age student at the turn of the 20th century, your literacy was probably higher than if you are a college student at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, there's a reason why. In the 20th century, you had the end of the Victorian era, where you had, say, a lot of complicated literature, admittedly a lot of literature with what we would call purple prose, which is prose added to increase the word length. This, of course, has the effect of making reading more difficult. As opposed to, say, the 21st century, where we're all on cell phones and Twitter, and we can't seem to digest stuff past 140 characters. So, social media has definitely affected modern literacy, and not for the better. But with that said, we're talking today about literacy in the ancient Near East. Now, in the ancient Near East, you had a variety of different kinds of languages. You had everything from cuneiform in Mesopotamia to hieroglyphic languages in, say, Egypt. And then you had the development of alphabetic script in the Levant. One of the sort of criticisms of, say, the writing of the Torah, at least, say, even going back, say, 50, 80 years ago, was the idea that Moses couldn't have written the Bible because he didn't have a written language to do it in. Well, today, we know that the development of the early alphabetic scripts dates back to the early Bronze Age. So the alphabetic script had been around for a long, long time prior to Moses. Nevertheless, it's often also assumed that just because a script is easier to read, this would necessarily increase literacy. It's true that in, say, the ancient world, most people were illiterate. Okay? Literacy was not widespread in the ancient world. But there were times and places where it was better than others. Like, for example, in Mesopotamia. Even though documents were really, really important in Mesopotamia, and everyone had like illegal contracts, receipts, there was a huge amount of writing being used and done in Mesopotamia. However, the vast majority of people could not read that cuneiform. And it was really more the priests that were able to read it and help the average person negotiate those written documents. Now, on the other hand, in Egypt, you did have a trickle-down effect. Even though the actual written script is much more complicated, you actually had more trickle-down of the language. So you would have, if you were a part of, say, the craftsman class, a lot of craftsmen could read. You had to read if you were a draftsman. You had to read if you were a decorator. Even people who were, say, carving tombs had to read. And most of the foremen of these tomb builders were able to read and write. So there always was this trickle-down effect in Egyptian culture where at least some people could read who were not necessarily at this sort of the priestly or scribal classes. We even find that there was reading among, say, generals and military men. So there was a lot of literacy in Egypt. And even in, say, among priestly classes, when we look at the scope of what priests were like across the ancient Near East, literacy was not ubiquitous. For example, while the priests of Mesopotamia and Egypt were literate, except maybe for Wab priests, because we're not sure of the literacy of Wab priests or what's called purification priests in Egypt. Priests in, say, cultic centers in the Levant might not have been literate because there wasn't that sort of lector tradition where priests would have to read incantations and spells or contracts. So it seems to be the case that a very small number of people, much smaller number of people, could read in the Levant than, say, in its two larger neighbors. So what we seem to find is that literacy is not a function of how easy a script is to read, but it does seem to be a function of how easy a script is to copy. And I think that's really, really important factor in literacy too. And this is why alphabetic scripts eventually won the sort of script wars here. You know, every technological revolution has its, technological competitors. VHS versus beta. Every technology has its test runs, and eventually one succeeds over the others. Well, in written scripts, the alphabetic scripts eventually win out over both cuneiform and hieroglyphic. But the reason why it wins out, is not because it's automatically easier to read. In some ways, it's more difficult. Alphabetic script has no determinatives. So there's no pictures there to give you little hints of what something should say. So it's not necessarily easier to read alphabetic script. But what it is easier to do is copy. And if you can make copies easily, you can transmit a piece of writing so that more people have access to it and more people can read it. This is what we find in the days of Jesus Christ. When he goes up to the synagogue in Nazareth, he pulls out a scroll, he opens it up, and he reads from the scroll. because this is the tradition of the synagogue movements. By the time the Israelites return from Babylon, what we have now is a reading culture. A culture that is where reading has percolated down into, say, non-priestly areas of society. Where carpenters can read, where, say, fishermen may not be able to read, but as merchants, they probably had some capacity to read. So it's highly, highly likely that, given the milieu of the New Testament, most of the apostles probably were able to read. We know that they were probably polyglots. They could probably speak 2 or 3 languages. They could at least speak Greek and Hebrew, possibly also Aramaic, and maybe even a smattering of Latin. But also, the culture of the first century Roman Empire was one of very, very high literacy. We compare it to the literacy of the past. First century Rome was at an all-time high at that point. The Roman Empire had public libraries. They were essentially reading libraries. So you could go to this public library, pick a scroll off the shelf, and you could just read it. So literacy was really, really common. It still wasn't ubiquitous. It wasn't that everyone could read, but the fact is that it had actually trickled down into the middle classes by that point. So there's a lot of interest in reading, and frankly, when the Roman Empire ultimately falls, we start seeing a decline of reading once again. That doesn't sort of pick back up again until, say, the reign of Charlemagne. So with that said, I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.